In a recent speech, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer rejected the idea that the UK has to make a choice between a Trump US and the European Union. He said the idea that we must choose between our allies, that somehow we're with either America or Europe, is plain wrong. I reject it utterly. The national interest demands we work with both. The first point to make on this is it's just plain stupid. On a political level, the US, EU and UK are allies. There are good political relations with both. The UK can work easily with both. It doesn't have to make a choice. But this point is just so obvious that it doesn't need saying. No one thinks that the UK has to make a political choice between the EU and US. The second point relates specifically to international trade policy. It's impossible to have close trade relations in the form of, say, a free trade agreement with both the European Union and US. Now, the UK has a free trade agreement with the EU, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. We know that the Starmer government wants to reset relations with the EU and possibly try and get the agreement to be more substantial. This inevitably means that the UK is likely to remain aligned or even commit to more alignment with EU regulations. This means that it is impossible to have a free trade agreement with the United States. The United States would want the UK to liberalise some of its regulations that came from EU membership. So if it stays aligned to the EU, it makes a free trade agreement with the US impossible. Now, previous UK-US negotiations broke down, and there were a number of big issues which made it impossible to make progress. One of the biggest areas of dispute is on health and safety regulations. The US generally has less regulation than the EU. So the US would expect more US products to be permitted to be sold in the UK that are currently banned. And the high profile areas are chlorinated chicken and hormone-treated beef, both of which are banned in the UK and the European Union. Now let's just pause for a minute here on why US chicken is washed with chlorine. The US has lower production standards than the UK and EU. The EU and UK have much higher standards in the chain of production. So in the US, chicken is more likely to be contaminated, and it has to be washed with chlorine in order to be fit for human consumption. There are also issues around US companies having access to providing NHS services. There's issues in relation to data privacy. There's also issues in relation to financial service regulation. The fact that it's going to be very difficult for the UK to have an agreement with the US on an FTA was recently confirmed in press reports where a close advisor to Trump was quoted saying that, "I've always said that Britain has to decide. Do you want to go towards the European socialist model, or do you want to go towards the US free market?" The risks are really high here. Elon Musk, who's the new co-head of Department of Government Efficiency in the Trump government, has promised to slash US regulations even more. He's threatened to abolish the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. A Trump donor suggested that this bureau has been terrorizing financial institutions. But this bureau was set up after the 2008 financial crisis in order to provide consumers with more protection to ensure that a 2008 crash couldn't happen again. The 2008 problems were caused by the financial service industry, and this had a massive impact on the global economy and on taxpayers in many different countries who had to bail out many banks. So this gives an idea of what the US would be looking for if it was to agree a free trade agreement with the UK. I think it would expect the UK to deregulate, to reduce consumer regulations. And this just seems highly unlikely, in fact, impossible. The previous government thought that it was going to be easy to have a free trade agreement with the US. But this proved only to be possible if the UK was to diverge significantly from EU food standards, financial regulation standards, data privacy rules. Given that Starmer has prioritised the reset with the EU, it just means that it's impossible for the UK to have a free trade agreement with the US. So clearly, in this way, the UK does have to make a choice between the EU and the US. And it would seem by Starmer's statements that he's choosing the EU. Labour sounds naive when it talks about trade policy. The UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves was quoted in The Telegraph as saying that the UK would make strong representations about the importance of free and open trade to Trump's team. Now, I've worked in and around trade negotiations for decades, and I've met many US trade negotiators. They're highly competent, they're highly expert, they're highly effective. I would not be lecturing the US on the benefits of open trade. So we can say with some certainty that the UK will not have a substantive free trade agreement with the US, and that there will be no improvement in market access to the US for UK products. There is one possibility for a little bit of good news. Trump has hinted that he might exempt the UK from the additional tariffs that he's intending to impose when he gets into power. He's suggesting 10 to 20% on all imports and 60% on Chinese imports. Now, if he was to exempt the UK, this would give UK exporters an advantage vis-a-vis other exporters to the US market. But of course, Trump will expect something in return. It is possible that the UK could make some concessions to the US without undermining its reset with the EU, but this will require a real balancing act, really clever and smart negotiation. If I was going into these negotiations, I certainly wouldn't be lecturing the US on the importance of open trade. So Starmer's claim that there's a choice between the US and the EU oversimplifies the realities of trade policy. It just sounds naive. In the UK, we've had so much dishonesty around trade policy, all sorts of things promised in relation to Brexit, the US, and frankly, this is just more of the same. In conclusion, I agree that there are strong political ties with both allies, that these ties are vital, and that we don't need to make a choice at the kind of highest political levels. But achieving close trade relations with both is impossible due to fundamental regulatory differences, and to imply otherwise is just dishonest. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.